and you haven't been to any of the sessions today, it'd be great if you introduce yourself on the chat. I know people have dipped in and out, and it's helpful for the speaker to know. We also were just discussing what word best describes innovation, and I asked first thing this morning, and you can see they're shared on the chat. But but do add them if they've changed since this morning, or you feel any different. I'm Nancy Kinder, and I'm delighted to welcome Rosemary to our Kin Summer Workshop. I would have loved Rosemary to be in person because she's got so much energy and enthusiasm. I feel totally inspired every time I chat with Rosemary. And she is perfect for our innovation network. Let me give you a sample, and I've got to read this, so apologies, on what she gets up to. She leads on commercialisation and innovation for the University of Greenwich. She's the managing director of her own innovation and knowledge agency. She's a member of the Knowledge Partners Forum, and she also chairs their knowledge, innovation and technology groups. And when she has time, I don't know how, is a board advisor for alternative events. So it gives me great pleasure for you to share your experience with Kin members and Kin guests this afternoon. Over to you for hearing Making the Market. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nancy. Obviously, it's a pleasure to be with you all. I'm not going to pretend that I can present the slides and read all of the comments in the chat at the same time. So I'll focus on the slides to start with, and then hopefully we can have a discussion. We do have options for a breakout, as Nancy has probably outlined in the pre-work, but it's up to us whether we would rather stay as a group or whether we'd rather have a breakout and then come back together. So, as Nancy said, a little bit about me. I think it's always helpful just to say I've got experience across a lot of industry sectors. I'm currently enjoying working with the University of Greenwich, as Nancy said, but it's my first foray into higher education. Most of my career has been spent in large companies, small companies, but lots of different sectors. I like to always mention that I'm a very keen yacht racer, just in case anybody wants to talk about that later. Normally it'd be over a beer, but you know, we are where we are. So where are we? We all know that we are going through a period of massive disruption. Title of all of the events today has been Innovation During Adversity, and I think all of us are probably feeling or have felt over the last few months moments of adversity, moments of complexity. But disruption and change is actually a constant in our lives, and I don't believe, whilst this is extreme, I don't believe that any of us probably in our recent careers has had a time where we've really felt, well, we really know what's coming, we really know what's going to happen. We don't have to look back too far, and even present in our today's environment, we've got the Brexit question. We've also got the massive impact of climate change, and depending which business you're in, that can really affect some of your strategic decisions, and that can then affect how you innovate and how you grow. So for me, I always say, well, okay, this might be a big amount of disruption, but it is still just disruption. So trying to get that under control, I thought I'd start with telling you about a situation I was in once where we were in what I would call a highly disruptive environment. So I was the global head of knowledge management for a medium-sized property and engineering firm. We were acquired by a global player, 27,000 people, and all of a sudden everybody was like, well, hang on a minute, what is knowledge management? We need to do this business transformation program, bring together 13 operating units, 27,000 people. We need an entire new layer and operating structure within it. And then one of the shareholder boards turned around and said, well, actually the most important thing we want to do is connect our people and help our people as a community, irrelevant of which of the background legacy businesses they were acquired from, feel like they have a voice and that they can be innovative and that they can contribute via innovation to the structure of the business that they're operating within and our future. Debbie's asked here who was the shareholder. Well, the company was called Arcadis, so it's one of the largest construction engineering consultancies in the world. So the shareholders were the shareholders of that company. So they gave me a fund, a ring-fenced fund, and they said, go away and create a global innovation program that's accessible to all our employees. You're not necessarily going to have a team, but we can get you a group of people that will be touch points for you in the various countries and the various operating units. And we're going to cover the water, the environment, the infrastructure and the buildings sectors across 70 countries. So it was a fairly substantial challenge, and one that required me to go away and ponder for a while. And in the end, I thought, well, the only way we can really do this is if we have a digital environment that we open up to everybody to participate and to share ideas, and that we make that a really basic level in terms of contribution. Now, that was in 2014. And in 2020, there are lots of platforms available that you can use to get your communities to crowdsource. But back in 2014, there were a couple on the market, and none of them really had the background structure that suited what I wanted to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the activities I undertook to set this program up. But the reason for sort of drawing on this experience is there I sat in the middle of this, what I would call a melee of a huge organisation with a huge complex business transformation going on, and around, I tell you, £55 million being invested, or euros actually, because it's a European company, in terms of the transformation. That gives you some idea of the size of what was going on. And that was disruption. It was disruption for every person who was employed in that organisation. And my job was to try and find a touch point and a way that I could bring them all into an environment where they could be aware of their opportunity to innovate and choose whether or not they wanted to contribute. So what role does knowledge management play in this? And this is where it gets quite interesting. You can imagine that across this massive organisation, as is often the case across large organisations, knowledge is not necessarily curated in the way that you would want it to be to facilitate innovation. And so when that happens, you have to sort of pick out the really important threads in terms of knowledge curation for the objectives that you're trying to achieve. And if that's to build an innovation portfolio for future growth, which is based upon the markets that your organisation is targeting, and I'm saying this generically because it's relevant for everybody, then you have to pick out the important bits of knowledge to curate. And I'll talk a little bit later probably about the 80-20 rule. You can go mad, and I know that we've all done this, over worrying about the very last piece. But actually, if you just get the majority or access to the majority of what you think you need to know, you're going to be far further forward than you were in the first instance. So what role does knowledge management play? Now, I've looked at this for many years, roughly, I don't want to even say how many. I'm not going to say how many because it's too many. And so what role knowledge management? Put it out over the company, the project, the culture, and the people. And the reason I split it into those four things is you can actually pick individual areas that you want to focus on. So if you look at crowdsourcing, which I think is a great way to get your communities to become active and engaged, you can either drive them by their own ideas, and you can make it very open and say, share whatever it is you think is going to help the company innovate, or you can guide them. And if you start to guide your communities around specific topics, depending upon your organisation, then you can really start to see a flow of what would previously be a mixture of tacit and explicit knowledge moving forward. And that's really quite interesting. You also have to look at the culture, which we all know about, and also on the broader company level, think about the context. So is this a priority for your leadership? I was on a call the other day with some of the leaders of the professional services sectors for the United Kingdom, and it was absolutely fascinating because one of the managing partners said, knowledge management today is more important than it has ever been before. And I will admit, it previously wasn't a priority. Now, that was absolutely fascinating because it suddenly says that if you don't have your knowledge curated, if you don't know what you know, if you don't understand your external markets, if you don't understand your client base, how can you possibly innovate? A, so that you don't already recreate the wheel, but B, innovate in the right direction. And so even though we're in a time of disruption and change, understanding where your organisation sits in that bigger ecosystem is really critical for effective innovation, and then driving that through your communities and potentially through a crowdsourcing tool, but you can actually do it without any flashy tools if you don't have them, is a really powerful technique to use. So for me, where I conclude in the last few months is knowledge management is more important than ever. it is more important than ever to have the right content to the right person at the right point in the process. Now, I know, Nancy, you've got a question in here. And one of Nancy's questions at this point for people to think about was around what is the new content that you're creating at this point in time. And for us, I look at my organisation at the moment, we're using new technologies in new ways. So we're using Teams, we're using team sites, we're using Yammer, we're using ways to curate and save content that is totally different from how we were doing it 6 months ago. And so when you move through that, understanding that that needs to be structured and searchable is a given. But in another way, we're suddenly in this world where if you take our example today, we're recording this session. And therefore, this session is potentially later on going to include discussion and tacit knowledge that we may never have been able to curate historically. Now, if you can take tacit knowledge in the way we're exchanging it all around the world today, and if you can use advanced technologies to make this not just something that you can watch, but something that you can search and something that you can use, then you're into a whole other paradigm in terms of the way that you can curate tacit knowledge, which in our previous lives was virtually impossible without a massive intervention in terms of interviewing and interpersonal activity. So we'll move forward into why the knowledge layer enables innovation. I've sort of touched on some of these things already. For me, it's the 80-20 rule. Think about your outcomes. Don't try and worry about splitting knowledge into different types. We all know that there's lots of different types of knowledge. Just think of it as one large entity. And then think about the innovation layer and think about what it is that you need to put in to enable outcomes that are relevant for your organisation. So is it artificial intelligence? Is it the ability to layer artificial intelligence over your content and have really smart outcomes? Is it machine learning, deep learning, robotics process automation? Is it around innovation in your services? It might be that you are in the manufacturing space and therefore it's Internet of Things, sensors, understanding the built environment, infrastructure delivery, or your products. But whatever it is, because I know we've got a wide range of organisations on this call, understanding that innovation outcome that you seek in its broadest sense and mobilising your communities to support that, enabled via your knowledge layer, is really, really important. So I think it's always helpful to sort of get people to think about the bigger picture in terms of their innovation ecosystem. And it is a big thinking piece. You know, where do you sit? What does it mean? And how do you guide your communities to help with it? And a lot of people ask me this question, you know, what does innovation mean, Rosemary? I mean, what is innovation? And there's a simple way, you know, that innovation is something that is new for your organisation. And you really can simplify it down to that absolute point. But if you actually then split it into the different types of innovation across your organisation, you can start to see how innovation plays a role in different places. If we look to everything that we experienced as a society at the start of this crisis, is a word we could use, innovation in our supply chains suddenly became critical. We couldn't go to the supermarket, we couldn't get deliveries online, we were facing an entirely different pathway to procuring some of the basic goods that we needed for our day-to-day lives. And suddenly, you know, it's very clear that the supply chains across the country, across different sectors, have been massively disrupted because of this situation. Some businesses will not survive, some businesses are managing to cope without much impact, but they're struggling to grow. And so you're seeing that in supply chain innovation, there's a massive amount of activity going on. And that may be relevant for your organisation, depending what you do. But it's also important to understand your entire value chain. So not just the supply chain that leads in to let you do your product, but the value chain that you feed into and beyond. So moving forward onto a little bit of depth in terms of, you know, some of these things, I suppose, I've talked about to many people on many occasions. And sometimes when you say, yeah, I had a ring fence fund from a shareholder group and I designed a global innovation program. And when you start to think about how you actually do that, rather than the enablers that you have to do that, it can start to be a little bit daunting. So for me, I broke it down into lots of different areas in terms of what I was trying to achieve, what were the challenges, what was the design, and making sure you understand the stakeholder needs. And I've put these on here. I'm not going to go through them all because we could literally talk the program, the challenges, you know, for quite a long time. It was a massive piece of work. And if anybody wants to know more, I actually did publish a piece on it, which I'm happy to share with this community if you want to read it. So it's not that it's an easy thing to do, and I'm not going to pretend it was easy, because it wasn't. But what it let you do was tap into a community and actually end up structuring communities, because you started to see themes growing from the ideas that came from this large group of people all around the world. And where it became fascinating was when you had the same ideas coming out of one area, one country, one region, that then tied in to another area or another region or another country. And you could then build a community that started to traverse and break down organizational barriers. And when you're facing disruption and culture becomes affected by that, breaking down those organizational barriers via building communities and sharing knowledge via that to innovate becomes a very powerful tool. And this sort of goes into some of the ways I did that. So crowdsourcing for knowledge, curation and innovation. I mean, this is essentially where you tap into your communities. You know, what was key for me, everybody was able to participate. It wasn't an internally ring-fenced team. It wasn't a group of people that said, we are the innovators or we are the accelerator or any of that. It's allowing everybody to participate. And I can't stress how important that was. And in the world today, there will be a lot of people that have had experiences that are going to have something different to contribute than we thought before. Even if we look at the what I call the inflection point of society that we've seen in the last few months, delivery drivers, we all know, and we've seen the headlines, became our critical lifeline for certain things. And for some people and some groups of society, they became beyond critical, they became lifesavers. So when you break down the people that you allow to contribute to your innovation or your ideation platform, processes, whatever it is, methodology, you actually exclude ideas from people that may have a great offering for you, but you don't actually give them an opportunity. So including everybody is really, really important. We didn't use an external accelerator at this point because, again, I said this to the construction and consultancy procurement councils. Nobody knows your business better than the people that work in it. And if you don't tap into their expertise and knowledge about your organisation and ask them to contribute, then you're really missing something. And if you've already got communities that are very active, and you've already got communities that are subject matter experts to doing, then there's a great opportunity for them to come forward and share future-looking ideas to help you innovate. You know, in my case, funding was already in place when I did this particular program, but the work I'm doing at the moment, funding isn't in place. You have to go out and find funding based on the innovation. So I've done it from both sides of the coin. Does it make it easier that funding's in place? To be honest, no, it didn't, because ultimately you've still got a whole raft of other things that you need to have to make it work. So, you know, you've got the typical social elements in there. Again, we're going back 6 years. There's a lot of advanced activity now around, you know, being able to vote and share ideas and all those things. But the key for me in here, and this is where you're in a really strong position, if you've already got communities of practice, this allowed us to form communities. There was no formal knowledge management and no communities. But if you've already got communities, you've got a massive opportunity to sort of jump on here. So I would like to think about, well, what's the impact? You know, how do you measure and think about the impact of knowledge management? Why is it relevant to build what I call a knowledge-based learning organisation for your people, the clients that you seek to serve, and the outcomes that you seek to drive? And, you know, we don't need to read our way through this, but the one thing that I've highlighted here that is going to be so relevant, and it doesn't matter, you know, where you're from or what your organisation does today, productivity is going to have been affected by what we have been through over the last 2 to 3 months. And from the point of view of future economic growth or future business growth or the success of your organisations, whatever it is that you do, productivity is a key element that is enabled via this circular impact. And we see that the productivity insights that we're getting across the United Kingdom at the moment are showing that we're going to take a massive hit. And so this is a way that we all have a potential to start to influence and grow what we do. And I just wanted to highlight that in there in this circle, rather than talk through every single piece. I mean, we can if that's what people want to do. And I'm going to leave it open. So I'm going to mute the breakout discussions, but I am going to open the chat feed in the Collaborate panel, because it's been pinging away throughout the discussion. And I think there's possible questions in here. Debbie saying, what was the question I posed to employees in the first place to get started? Initially, no question, Debbie. It was just, we opened up an innovation program to everybody and we invited them to share ideas, and we positioned what we meant by ideas. After about 6 months, then I started working with our major clients and looking at their primary innovation challenges and then feeding those through as guided challenges for the organisation. What practice of knowledge curation did you use? So from a point of view of knowledge curation, you might have to explain exactly what you mean by that, David, but in the organisation I was in, there was no knowledge curation practiced formally. So the innovation programme drove the ability to curate knowledge. Lots of questions. In awards, yes, I also used to run an awards process from it. So probably several hundred ideas would flow in a year. So an average portfolio across a period would be about 80 ideas that I would fund and take forward. Not all of them to commercialisation, about 15% to full commercialisation. And then I would give out awards at the global gathering of the leaders of the organisation to celebrate innovation. How difficult was it to create engagement? What worked best? It was really hard to create engagement initially. So it was initially around awareness. So my perspective was I wanted 100% of people to be aware of the programme. And I recognised that it was roughly going to be about 20% of people that would engage with the programme on one level or another. And that was data that was given from Accenture. So it was fairly reliable in terms of targets that I was aiming for. Getting that 100% awareness was really, really difficult in the first instance because the organisation was so fragmented. You were dealing with something that was going business transformation, huge disruption, huge cultural change for every single person that worked there at the same time as trying to launch this programme. And that's sort of why I talk about it at the moment, because it was a time of massive disruption at the same time as trying to build something that was forward-looking in terms of innovation. So it was hard. In the end, the best way to get engagement for me was I picked ambassadors in each country, I picked ambassadors in each business line, and I picked ambassadors in each legacy operating company. And I worked with the 200 global leaders of the organisation to show them the value of doing this and to push it through. And until I had my first outcome in terms of innovation success, in terms of commercial success, that was a really, really difficult thing to get people on board with. So it really ended up being you had to walk before you actually got engagement.
There was a reflection earlier on, Rosemary, about, and it sort of follows on nicely from there, is what question did you pose to them to first get them started? Was there a particular question or activity that you got them? I mean, we've talked about engagement, but what one thing did you do to get them started?
No, in the first case, it was just making sure everybody was aware of the programme. So it wasn't a question, it was an awareness raising exercise to let them know that this programme existed and there was funding attached to it. The next set of questions probably came about a year into the programme. So it took me 6 months to design it, develop it, launch it. And then about 6 months after initial operation, that was when I started doing the guided challenges. So those would be working directly with our clients and then asking the community that had engaged specific targeted questions around innovation. So it could be, I'm trying to think what's not a commercially sensitive question. I don't know. Let's have a look now at the big innovation challenges that we face as a world today. There's about 30 that have just been publicised that feed in behind the UN Global Sustainability Goals. Let's say wireless energy. So you might pose a question, remembering there's no formal knowledge curation in this organisation. Anybody ever worked on wireless energy? Has anybody got any information on this? What's your expertise level? So we didn't even have a people directory that we could look at expertise and competence at, which is a very basic level of knowledge curation around your assets, your people assets in a business. We didn't even have that. So that allowed us to group together all of the people around a particular topic, and that was when the communities started to be viable for formation. There's a lot of questions coming in, so most communities, how did you get them just to focus on innovation? In the end, when the community started to form, so as I say, this was about a year into the programme in terms of the point. When the community started to form, they didn't only focus on innovation, so they were driven by an innovation challenge, but actually as they started to come together, they were just sharing, firstly they were meeting for the first time. So a lot of them had never ever met each other before. Companies, they were from different countries, they were from totally different business lines in some cases. So the first case, it brought people together, and then it allowed them to become a community, and then they started sharing their experiences, their knowledge, their case studies, and then we started to move on to the innovation space. So the guided challenges did a different thing from the initial question that was just around share your ideas. And when you say to somebody share an idea, if you're very specific about what you mean by an idea, whilst not being restrictive in terms of anything being viable, then people do focus on more of the innovative side of thinking. Is everybody up for a 10-minute breakout? Ask me anything.
Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with that. Entirely up to the floor.
We'd love you to be in one of the groups, because I'm sure people will continue to ask you questions. The questions Rosemary proposed based on her session was, do you see knowledge creation as an essential to innovation in your organisation? Have you or would you establish a managed programme to inspire innovation? And communities are the wealth of knowledge. What challenges have you faced through integrating knowledge and innovation in your communities? I suggest, as we're coming up to 4 o'clock, that we all have a break in these groups that is organised by the moderating team. And then whatever comes up in your group, come back. We'll still have some time to ask Rosemary any further questions. As there's no one other than Debbie asking for anything different, I'm going to take that as silence as a thumbs up. And we'll now ask the team if they could break us out into groups to discuss these questions. I put them in the chat, but I think they'll be reminded. A lot of people are leaving now. Oh yeah. Dear.
It's up to the people what they'd rather.
Oh. Discussions. I don't know if Debbie, you want to share what happened in Rosemary's room, but for us, we were saying building the engagement but sustaining it is quite hard, and it's those incremental differences we need to get better at celebrating so more people follow us, and we were talking about different ways of using things like Teams to share that progress. What about the other breakout rooms? What for Rosemary?
I think from our group, so group 1, in fact, Rosemary, I joined a little bit late just because of some of the logistics. So Rosemary was already well and truly in flow really with the guys there, which is nice to hear. So I think probably Rosemary or Paul or the best to answer that question.
I mean, I can just summarise what we talked about, and then Paul or Sabine can jump in. I mean, fundamentally, what was sort of clear is that the management knowledge curation is more important than ever in this new virtual or blended virtual and human world, because it's being seen now as a support network for onboarding and learning and bringing in new people, and also that concept of how to facilitate what would previously perhaps be water cooler conversations around innovation. So where there's not a formal program in either of the organisations we just talked with, both of them saw that there was a recognition culture within their organisations for innovation, but it wasn't formalised in how you participated, and that perhaps in the virtual world it was more important than ever to think about integrating that. I don't know if Paul or Sabine want to pop in with anything else. So we sort of covered the first two questions.
I think that covers it. To be honest, I think we talked about, you know, introducing knowledge management at an early stage, so people are really becoming familiar with it at the outset. So it's no longer seen as, you know, quite far down the food chain when it comes to services that the organisation is offering. I think it's about pushing knowledge management to the forefront and making everyone aware of the importance of it. And it's almost getting around the big table now. So you're actually taking part in the strategic discussions as opposed to just a service that's been provided as part of a much larger set.
Great, thank you, Paul. And was it Davide and Suzanne, were you in a group together? Could either of you share what you discussed in?
Yeah, so Suzanne has written one question. So how do you move a community from knowledge sharing and peer assist to objective-driven working? So how do you make the community start working toward an objective, which means started to go toward innovating? So,
Do you want me to say something? So there's a lot of typing going on here in the background.
Yeah, whoever's not talking but typing, please could you mute yourself, because I think it's overriding the person who's trying to talk. Thank you.
I think Michael's given a good input here. For him, the purpose is the key. Build your objectives to provide the what's in it for me. It's amazing now, isn't it? We all know what that acronym is with him. I think
we didn't know GOAT though, so thank you, Paul, for that one.
I think when you get objective-driven working, you know, somebody once said to me, "You can only have one first priority, Rosemary," and I was like, "Really? Okay." And I think it does come down to that little bit. I think you have to try and determine very, very clearly what innovation means for your organisation. And if you can do that, and you can therefore shape and frame objectives around that, even if that leads to more than one objective, but if that innovation is that priority, then it's quite important. And just while I've got it in my head, and then I'm going to ask Suzanne, because I know she wants to say something. There was a survey done the other day of the general public around how important innovation was, and it was around the relationship between higher education and innovation. And there wasn't an age group or a focus group or a population representative that did not list innovation as being one of the most important things for society moving forward. And that was fascinating, really fascinating. Suzanne, over to you.
Yeah.
Go.
Thank you. The question that I have is, what are we talking about when we are talking about communities? Because what I see, for example, in our organization is that we don't have a problem finding innovations when it is in a very small project team, when it is basically everybody is familiar with things already. We do have communities of practice, but a lot of them are really about knowledge sharing, sort of finding support from each other. And I wonder, is there something that helps when you have these bigger communities of practice to actually get to a point where they become innovative, where it's not just about sharing best practices, talking to each other, and sort of almost helping helping each other, but in a very non-structured way, and in a very sort of touch point way, but actually getting to a point where people take ownership, where they actually say, hey, this sounds like a really nice challenge, I want to get involved in that, where people actually really sort of start having an objective and actually having an interest in taking things further out of a discussion and into something that is a bit more hands-on towards innovations. And that's what I mean with sort of working towards an objective. So is that really something that is possible within a community of practice, or is there something in addition that is needed to encourage these kind of processes to happen? And also, how do you deal with the fact that, especially when you have quite big communities of practice at a global level, you often end up with people having very, very different levels of expertise and skills, which then sort of changes the kind of discussions that you're likely to have in the spaces where you're trying to connect people. So how do you manage that, and how important is managing these kind of things in order to help innovation processes?
Yeah, so that's quite a lot of questions. I think just let's take the first one. I mean, I think absolutely, if you've got a series of communities, even if they're quite large in terms of the number of people, even if they're cross-country, even if they're cross whatever business line, you can absolutely bring them together, because presumably they're in a community because they have a subject matter in common. So I don't know which company you work for, Susanna. Is it you able to share that, or?
It's a charity, so we're working across the world, but with very, very different skill levels. Okay, so depending what the charity does, so it's not really about the revenue model. So I don't what sort of charity? What's your I mean, where do you serve? What bit? Working in girls empowerment.
Female empowerment for girls.
Girls empowerment, yes.
Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, so where you've experts around that subject, so that's your big subject, and then presumably you've got subject matter experts around the individual elements that contribute to that, and sharing knowledge around the things that are going to enable that around the world. And so as you move into that and you shape people into those subject matter groups, if you can get your community to identify the real subject matters that they're talking about, not just sharing knowledge around and best practice around, but the actual subject matter that they're expert around, and then start to look at what the need is around that in a particular country or a particular section of society, however you target it, you can then drive innovative thinking through that. And that would need to initially, I would say, be facilitated at minimum. Managed is a strong word, but certainly facilitated to make it happen. And I definitely think that that's an area that you could take communities forward, particularly for that subject and outcome. Absolutely. In terms of skill level, for me, I think it's difficult to make a judgment without knowing a bit more about the organisation. But I mean, I would say that if you've got somebody that's very experienced with a top level skill, put them in as one of the facilitators around a subject matter and inspire them to start to look at the opportunity and bring other people along with them. And so that's just one way you could structure it, which is probably based on the information I've got, what I would do.
I was just calling out if there was yeah. Did you see that earlier? I don't know if you missed that, but Paul was talking about his onboarding system and how it was the greatest thing. Is it great? I've got to find. I'm going to get it wrong now. Greatest of all time. The acronym is GOAT. Right, before we close, it'd be great to have one more question, and I can see Debbie's asking it. Rosemary, what is the optimal number for innovation to be effective in a community? What's the optimal number of people in your experience?
I would say, I mean, I don't know if there's an optimal number. I mean, I think there's an optimal level of engagement. So you really don't want a community to have people in it that don't actually contribute or say anything. Now that isn't to say that people have to be really extrovert and engaged, but there has to be a method that people can engage to suit their personality types, but they have to be enabled to engage. In my experience, I say anything that you try and do in this environment, and I'm talking specifically now about our virtual world, 20 people, is going to be difficult. And anything that you do face to face, probably beyond 20 people, if you're genuinely trying to get into the depths of what do we need to do to innovate this, you're genuinely trying to, you know, ultimately solve a problem, move the organization forward, do some thinking, design sprints, all of those tools that are available to you. It's quite hard to lead that with very big teams, but you could have a larger community and then split them out into groups and then bring them back together, which anybody that would have heard David Gertein's talk earlier and has ever been to one of his knowledge cafes knows that's exactly how they work. So there's lots of ways you can manage a larger group. You know, if you have 3 people and they can all talk, but they're not necessarily the subject matter experts, or they're not necessarily the people that are going to be able to drive the community forward, then having a smaller group doesn't necessarily benefit. So I think it's very subjective to be able to answer that, but there are ways I suppose the question is your community working against the metrics that you're measuring it against? And if the answer is no, is that because it's too big, or is there something else you need to think about? Probably the easiest way I can answer that.
And we could spend all day talking about community engagement, I'm sure. But I want to thank you, Rosemary, for taking the time to put this together and being available to talk to KIN members and KIN guests today. I hope this session was useful. I'm not sure if the breakout rooms were a bit disruptive, but maybe that was good because it helped us think about the content and connect to that, and then come back to you with more questions. The whole day has been incredible, and it's amazing that we've still got many people that have been here since 9 o'clock this morning and finishing off with us this afternoon. Louise will send you the links to the slides, to the recordings, and we'd love to know how you found this first virtual workshop. What worked, what didn't, how can we improve it for next time? We really do practice what we preach, so we want to learn and evolve with you. So your feedback is really appreciated. The next event from KIN is on the 7th of July. Michael was sharing that with you earlier with Judy Payne about what is information and what is knowledge management, and why we shouldn't mix up the two. So look out for that on the Innovation Network LinkedIn site or on Twitter. Follow us to find out when the next session you can join. For all your participation throughout the day, particularly to the facilitators for helping me manage the chat. It's been incredible discussion. I'll share this with you, Rosemary, afterwards, so you can really see what they connected to. And I hope to see you all at another KIN event again soon. Thank you, everyone.